As some of you may know, I was involved with CORC for many years, and it's so fantastic to see it in such great shape and with such great leadership. But I now work as Director of Mental Health at the Wellcome Trust, which is a big biomedical research funder. We give away about £1 billion a year in science research funding. And I'm delighted to say that mental health is now one of 4 things that we are focused on as a funder. The other 3 are broad discovery research, climate and health, and infectious disease. So we are entirely sort of committed to trying to transform outcomes for mental health. And what I'm going to share with you is just some aspects of what we're doing that may be particularly relevant to CORC members, particularly focusing on the sort of metrics work we're doing. I'm trying to keep this deliberately brief so there's time for questions, because I'm going to need to drop off a little early, so I won't be here for the general questions and answers. Great, thank you. Next slide, please. Great. So our ambition is a world in which no one is held back by mental health problems. So a nice small ambition that we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please. And the projects I'm going to talk with you about today are 4 projects. One around how we understand and think about effective treatments in terms of their core components, how we can make best use of existing data, how we can develop data initiatives that empower people who are sharing their data, and how we can advance the harmonization of metrics and common metrics. They're part of a more general strategy, which is still being developed and being finalized. Do have a look on our website. We try and have a principle of learning in public. So we post LinkedIn blogs and we put stuff on our website. Please do look there to see where the latest opportunities are for funding, but also for just our thinking and our development as we go forward. Next slide, please. So in terms of the active ingredients, this is an attempt to try, as many of you will be aware, mental health science is full of quite complicated ideas around what might help people with a lot of different interacting parts. We think probably the solutions that people need to address their mental health problems are going to be complicated and varied, but we also think for the science to advance, we need to disaggregate them a bit into their constituent parts, so we get away from these sort of branded, all-encompassing, all singing and dancing interventions. It's very hard to know what actually is making the difference. So we've come up with this concept of active ingredients, which are those aspects of an intervention that are really driving the change and making the difference, and that we can then look at as constituent parts. And that might be things ranging from positive activities to repetitive negative thinking, to reducing loneliness, to a sense of mattering, to having more money, to changing brain chemistry. They might range from the cellular to the societal. And we've been working with the company on this sort of visualization, which young people have told us they find helpful in terms of just thinking about it almost like a sort of cookery, where we're trying to think what are the active ingredients you need to make a cake, which may be different for different people. And those ingredients may come both from professionals and from individuals. They may range from self-care to professional care. Next slide, please. So as part of that work, we've been commissioning a series of reviews of the literature, which tells us which active ingredients we have evidence for and what they tell us. I've lost the look of the slides, but I don't know whether others can still see them. Oh, they're coming back. Great. So we've commissioned 47 reviews, and we've then grouped them loosely into these 6 categories. These are by no means perfect categories, but they're just a way of just making a list of 47 a bit more manageable to look at. And we've been trying to then look at thinking about how we would, and we've published a review of these active ingredients, and CORC has been part of the commission teams, both working on specific active ingredients, but also in terms of reviewing how young people, what young people thought might be missing, and how they engage with this agenda overall. We've published a summary of all the learning to date, of about 20 or so of the reviews so far, and there are another 20 just completing now. And we'll be looking next year then to be thinking about some major primary funding for research to then advance this agenda, to look at, okay, can we do actual trials and research that will explore how these or other active ingredients work and who they work for, in what context and why. So that's one big agenda we're pursuing, and we'd be interested in your views and thoughts on that. Next slide, please. So another agenda is, another agenda is really to think about how can we understand those active ingredients and what works for people in terms of using existing data. So we're launching a data prize early next year, which will invite people to come together to review existing data sets, which we're currently sourcing in the UK and South Africa, and which will then invite people to work with data scientists to research those data sets, but then also develop tools that will help other researchers look at those data sets in terms of what works for whom and how we can make data more open to other researchers. Next slide, please. So as part of that, we're trying to look at how we source different data sets, how we address impactful research questions, how we involve young people right from the start and how those data are going to be used, and how we bring together multidisciplinary teams to really analyze those data and try and address the many access hurdles that I and others have experienced, where it can take years and years to get at data that really we want to try and streamline that process, whilst also being respectful of the need to respect people's privacy, and also ensuring data equity, and also ensuring that those from whom the data collected are advantaged by the use of that data. So we try and avoid data colonialism or data extractivism. Next slide, please. And I guess that's something to think about for CORC members in terms of the CORC data set, how those sort of issues might be addressed. So an allied project then is also about collecting new data. So we've commissioned a group led by Sage Bionetworks in the States, but with academic partners in the UK, South Africa and India, who are conducting a 2-year feasibility trial of different ways of collecting psychological, behavioral and environmental information from young people that can help us understand the trajectories of anxiety and depression over time, but also for this particular feasibility study, really look at how young people can be active partners in designing that study and thinking about how the data are used, and in balancing privacy with openness of data. So how can we get open science to sit alongside sort of empowerment of young people about their privacy? And this particular feasibility trial includes a randomized element of where people are randomized to different levels of data control, and also to an element where they choose different levels of data control, and also has as part of its methodology deliberative democracy, where a group of young people are talked through the pros and cons of different models of data control and access, and they think through what might be best for them. Next slide, please. So what we've learned from this so far is how hard it is to get data from young people, and which was reinforced, but also some ideas around how we might improve that, but also the absolute importance of including young people from the start who can really help think about what is meaningful in terms of engagement and what they want, and are very thoughtful about that balance between privacy and openness. And also what we're learning, because we're doing it in 3 different geographies, about the different strengths and challenges of the different regulatory frameworks in India, South Africa, and the UK. And again, I'm happy to talk through some of that if people are interested. Next slide, please. So moving to the last project that I wanted to mention to you that I think it may be specifically of interest to CORC members, is that we have developed our Common Measures initiative. And this is really bringing together a board, a Common Measures board of funders and journals who have committed to specific measures that if people are doing research with us on anxiety and depression, they must use if they want to be funded by us. And we have chosen in the first instance the PHQ, the GAD, the RCAD and the HUDAS. And obviously it's up to each individual funder and each individual grantee to actually agree in terms of exactly what will be used for in a given study, but the default position would be that they need to use these as core. They can use whatever other measures they want as well, but these would be as core. And we also have a group of advisors and a community of practice who are helping us advise on these measures and on how people are finding them. And we're really looking, what's been really fascinating about this is really digging deep into how far you can amend these measures to be culturally relevant and for them still to be useful in terms of comparison and use in research. Next slide, please. So I'm going to stop at this point because I want to give plenty of time for conversation and questions, but that I hope gives you some flavour of what we're doing and where we're up to and how it might link with the work of this consortium.
Thanks, Miranda. So opening up questions. Should we do hands up if you have a question? I can see a question from Kate Dalzell. Kate, do you want to unmute and ask your question of Miranda, starting with the home team?
Hi, Miranda. There's so much to dig into there, so I'm going to try not to be greedy. But the first thing that I'm really interested in is whether or not you think that the active ingredients are going to be stable across countries. Like, do you think that those are about being a human being and there's going to be some active ingredients which are just about the nature of mental health wherever you are? Or do you think that the active ingredients are completely, you know, kind of socially determined, community-based, embedded in the context where they are? Where do you think it's going? What are you seeing in that line?
So I would say from our summary so far, one of the difficulties is we don't have the data that is diverse enough to be able to answer that question. So most of the research is based in high income, often quite ethnically homogenous populations. So we don't really know. But from what research there is, I would say there's as much difference between individuals in a given culture as there are between differences between cultures in terms of the active ingredients. So I think it's more about personalization at the level of the individual rather than the level of the culture. There may be access issues, but I think it is more about being human. And I think just one thing actually I should have mentioned earlier, and just because it might be an interesting resource for people, we commissioned a big monitor, a global monitor of 119,000 people across 113 countries. I think those are the right stats, where we asked them about their experience of anxiety and depression. Quite broad questions, and also the sort of things they did to help with that. And what we found was huge continuity across the countries. There were some differences. All that report is out there. It's on our website. But what was more striking was the similarities rather than the differences. So have a look at that if you're interested. And also, just for people to aware, that data set is freely available to anyone who wants to use it. Any students who are interested in global mental health, or anyone that might be interested in sort of digging into how people experience mental health, or what their view is in terms of science and mental health, please do use that data set. It's all freely available on our website.
Thanks, Miranda. I'm going to go next to Wendy. Can you unmute and give us your question, please, Wendy?
Thank you. I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague of mine yesterday, talking about the concept of patient activation in relation to how to set, obviously, to establish appropriate personalised care planning. It was in the context of adults, but I was curious to understand whether any work has been done in the space, within Wellcome Trust sort of space, and within CORC perhaps more widely, to look at that concept for children in terms of self-management and self-care.
Yeah, so I can speak for Wellcome, and then I'll let Kate speak for CORC. Take on it. So in terms of Wellcome, I think what we're trying to do in terms of our research agenda is trying to get away from the distinction between people who are between professional care and self-care, and say we're just interested in what the active ingredients are, regardless of the context. So it may be that, for example, having more exercise might help with your mental health. Now, whether that's mediated by a professional or whether you do that by yourself, in a way, is another level of consideration. But we're trying to avoid categorizing things by whether the professional is the mediator of that or not. And I'll pass on to Kate on it to comment from CORC.
Actually, I see Julian has his hand up for a question, and I wonder if you might be the more natural person, Julian, because I know lots of your research has spoken to patient activation. So I I think you'd probably be more fun in answering this than me.
Well, I don't know about that, but yes, I was hoping you would pass on to me. We've got a couple of really fantastic PhD students who are looking into self-management, specifically for LGBTQ+ communities. And then another PhD student who's just started, who's really exploring the concept of self-care. And similarly, I think we're interested in this, whether it's within or not within a professional context. But I think what's going to be really interesting is how much is self-care for mental health something do people really associate the two, or is it just kind of part of people's everyday kind of self-care activities? Yeah, I think we've been really interested in the concept of patient activation, and we've been doing a study where we've developed with young people a mental health empowerment scale. So kind of building on what Miranda was saying, we've kind of sort of broadened out the concept. So it's how empowered, young people's levels of knowledge, skills and confidence to manage their mental health and mental health care. So that spans both their within things under their control and things involving contact with other services. So we're in the process of validating and writing that at the moment. The thing I wanted to ask Miranda, thank you, it was a really interesting talk. I know your team has a really strong patient and public involvement component, and I think it's really interesting because the sort of data science questions, access to data, using routine data, these can be some of the areas that might not be, on first glance, the easiest thing to do in conjunction with patients and the public. So yeah, I was just interested if there was anything you could say about, the great work you're doing under that area, please.
Yeah, so we're very lucky. So we're very lucky in two ways at Wellcome. First, we do have a lived experience team. In fact, many of you will know our lived experience head, Kate Martin, who has been involved with CORC and the Anna Freud previously, and is in fact, or was a CORC board member. And she has assembled a fantastic group of lived experience experts from across the globe who inform all our work and are involved in these projects. So for example, the MindKind project, it was through one of her team, Shiranjeet Thacker, who really set up the youth advisory groups and worked out a way of having a governance structure that has really sort of transformed that way of thinking about the data. And I think partly what we're trying to investigate in the MindKind study is how you can engage people in conversations about this in ways that are helpful and meaningful and not sort of dry as dust and feel like it's nothing to do with them. The other group that we have at Wellcome, which we're incredibly lucky, is we have a whole team called Data for Science and Health, who are specialists and have a whole team focused on open access and on data issues. And there was a team that's just finished, in fact, which was working on understanding patient data, who've come up with a whole set of guidance about how you balance trustworthiness of data with open data. So I think we are very engaged in this issue and sort of interested to learn from you and work with any other groups who are interested in this issue about how we talk about these things and embed them in ways that aren't dry and off-putting for people. Because at the moment, young people and those with mental health issues are having a double whammy of being saying it's all so sensitive that we must protect this data, it can never be used for research. And that is an equity issue in terms of then there being a lack of research on exactly the sort of topics we need to advance the field.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we did a study where we were having discussions with young people, parents and carers, about linking data between sectors to use for early identification systems. So we came up with an approach of explaining this through a hypothetical case example. So it was all anchored on an individual's experience. And yeah, not to blow our own trumpet, but that actually worked quite well. We were really pleased with that and the levels of engagement.
Please do share, it'd be really good. I mean, obviously share with the group, but share with us, because it's the sort of thing we're really interested in. So thank you.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks, Miranda. I can see that Ashley's hand is up next. Ashley, can you unmute?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and
Miranda,
clear.
this might be a bit of an obscure question, but I wonder whether Wellcome's giving any thought to the effect of climate change currently on children's anxiety and depression, and more importantly, the effect in 10 years. I suspect in 10 years, most young people are going to be really affected in mental health terms by climate change. And I'm just interested whether Wellcome's thinking about that.
Yes, so the answer is yes and no. It's not obscure at all. So as you know, we have a whole climate and health team. And we also have, in fact, a group currently within the Wellcome collection who are looking at solastalgia as a particular topic. So the Wellcome collection is a museum on the side of the trust. And we have a sort of embedded, what's called the hub, where we have an embedded group who is doing the mixture between cultural engagement and research. And they're looking particularly at this theme of people's experience of lost nature. So it's not the same as eco-anxiety, but it is an overlapping concept. So it's something that we're exploring culturally. From the point of view of the team that I lead, we are very focused on trying to find interventions that will stop people being held back, and in particular trying to intervene early to try and address that. So we've sort of ruled out of scope a focus purely on what are causing mental health problems, or what are, in the sense of sort of, you know, whether digital or climate change or other things are sort of leading to rises. Not that that isn't very important, but we're really, really focused on what would be the intervention you would do regardless of the reason for the rise, if you see what I mean. So we're very aware of it, actually, and it's something that is a growing area of knowledge, but our focus will be on what can you do about that to address it for those young people. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Miranda. I can see we've got some questions coming in the chat and we've got some hands up. So I'm going to go to Leslie Ann, and then I'm going to come to some people that put some comments in the chat. So Leslie Ann.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here as always. If I could pick up on your conversation around the data science and engaging youth, I had a question about the privacy and our notions of privacy. So I come from a data science background originally. I'm a researcher. And some of the concerns that we have around privacy haven't been shared by our participants. And in fact, they're quite shocked that we don't use their data regularly and that we don't make these linkages. I just wondered if you had any insights into navigating that balance, or if that's changed, or just your experience with that.
I would say our experience is exactly the same as yours, and I think echoes Julian's as well. And part of the issue is, how do we get that voice into the conversation, rather than other people who, with well-meaning intent, are imputing to young people on those mental health issues what they do and do not care about in terms of privacy. So I think we're in the same space on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Leslie Ann and Miranda. And I'm now going to go to Ro Rossiter.
Unmuting. Yeah, I couldn't find my button. So we've had mention around different geographies and culture, and also sexuality in the presentation and the sort of question and answers. I was just wondering how other factors like age, thinking of younger people, gender, ability and disability, and social class are being thought about and included. So basically it's the whole kind of EDI, but thinking about age, I'm also thinking about prevention and kind of building good mental health, as opposed to focusing on anxiety and depression. So there's quite a lot in that, but I'd be grateful for your views. Thank you.
Yes, so I think that all those aspects are really important. I guess the issue for us as a funder is how much burden to put on those we fund in terms of saying what you have to collect data on. So all of those things are of interest and relevant. And in terms of age, it's a very live debate at the moment as to how far we want to focus on the younger age range as a way of trying to get in early, bearing in mind that most problems start before the age of 30. For our focus is on anxiety, depression and psychosis, and for those in particular, problems tend to start by the age of 30, and if we can find ways of creating effective early interventions, we could change people's life trajectories. So that is something that is an ambition for us to think about, but we don't want to be too hard line on age, because we also recognize that in different contexts, when these things emerge and when they're first recognized may vary.
Thanks.
Thanks, Miranda. Thanks, Ray. There was a question in the chat that I now can't find from Sally.
I'll go back up to it. I wrote it down because it was a very convoluted question, so I thought best to just write it down.
Sorry.
And I guess this is, and I think you've maybe answered this a little bit in your response to Ashley, but it's just thinking about the next steps after this piece of work and having all of those ingredients, which is fantastic. Is there going to be any looking at what the treatments are that are currently offered as standard across mental health services, and do we think that any will be found to have a better fit, and are we advocating the right treatments in the face of changing mental health needs? So the causes of anxiety and depression, and like Ashley said, you know, climate change and things like that, are we doing what we've always done because that's what we've always done? Is there any of the treatments that are out there that we think actually we're continually commissioning those, but based on this research we should actually be commissioning something slightly different?
Yeah, they're great questions, and it very much does link to what Ashley was saying. So I think as a science funder, we will go wherever the science leads us. So if we find there is a new sort of anxiety or depression that requires a new sort of solution, then we're really interested in that, and we're interested in really putting out findings from right through from basic science to back translation, what works now, and trying to get that better. So we're interested in the full range, which may range from, as you know, there's a lot of excitement currently about the use of psychedelics, or there may be interest in different sort of social interventions against loneliness, or there may be interest in gut microbiome work and how that might change, or sleep. So there are a whole range where we are completely neutral as to what is the right intervention, and we are not set by anything that is currently offered or not offered. We are drawing on the sciences is where we are. So for example, just for you to know, one thing we funded currently is there's an intervention going on in ICUs, in intensive care units across the health service, which we funded, which is to try and address PTSD, which has arisen partly as a result of impact of COVID and looking after severe COVID cases on those in ICUs. And this intervention is neither a talking therapy nor a drug therapy. It's actually a digital therapy, which involves playing a game of Tetris for 15 minutes. That's the intervention, with a particular focus on asking people to hold in their mind a visual image as they do Tetris, which is a way of trying to reduce the number of intrusive memories that people get, which is one of the core symptoms of PTSD. I don't know whether it'll work. We will see. But it was something that we funded because our reviewers felt that this was something that had enough mileage in it to be explored as a potential intervention. And it is something where we're also working with, or the people that we funded are working with those who ran trials in COVID to do a new form of more agile trials in the NHS, which allows you to trial things faster with a more robust way of collecting data from people over time.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks, Miranda.
Just to give you an example.
We're at the end of your official time, Miranda, but if you've got time for a couple of more questions, we've got time for a couple more questions. Is that okay? There's a couple that have come in, one from Kate Ozell, one from Melissa, that are related to your core set of measures for research. I'm going to start with Kate and then move on to Melissa, if that's okay.
Yeah, I can see, I can really imagine the really strong arguments that have guided your decision to do that for the research that you're funding. And I just wondered what the trade-offs were in your mind, and whether you felt anything has been lost as well as gained in limiting down to those choices.
So I hope not, because we're not limiting anyone. We're just saying you have to do this and whatever else you want to do. And we deliberately chose things that we hope were really non-burdensome. So if people really can't do the whole PHQ-9, they can do PHQ-2. It's whatever is manageable within their data set, and then they can do whatever other measures they want. It's not a limiting down, it's a trying to get a common language. I guess the key aim here is we feel that for the field to advance, we need something equivalent to, for example, 5-year survival rates for oncology, or HbA1c for diabetes, some core measure that if you don't have it, you're not part of the conversation. Because at the moment, we've got 280 different measures of depression. So when you're reading the literature, you can't know when someone says people got better or didn't get better, what they're talking about. So you need something core that links in a way the existing literature together to allow us to have these conversations. And I think we are not saying these are fantastic measures. We are saying these are good enough, or were potentially good enough and non-burdensome enough and free enough to say use these alongside your other measures. I guess the trade-off that we have been challenged with is that people will experience them as us saying these are gold standard measures, you must use these and none others. And that would be a real shame if that's what people heard.
Thanks, Miranda. Melissa, does that answer your question, or do you want to ask a bit of a follow-on?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up very briefly. Nice to see you, Miranda. So, you know, do you want them used all of those measures together though, or is it okay if people select one of your measures in addition to their measures?
Select one.
Okay, yeah, because I think it's really helpful to have this, and I'm very curious to see how it pans out and how this potentially changes things in the long term. Because one of the things we've been saying, particularly, you know, for example, the emerging evidence series, it's really difficult to compare and know what it means in relation to other data if we're not using the same measures. But equally, in my work with some clinical services, we've had a lot of pushback on using certain measures, and they want things kind of as brief as possible and as short as possible. But then we're also limited in what we can say about that. So I'm pleased to see that there's been the push towards this, and keen to see how it turns out.
Yeah, no, thank you. We're also interested in it, and it's great to be combining here with colleagues in the States and in Canada and elsewhere. So, you know, I think if you can help us spread the word, this is not about limiting people's richness of data measurement, because we know these will not capture everything that everyone's interested in, but it's about having some core. The other thing, just to share, that I'm doing partly in my work at Wellcome, but I also keep a small amount of time at UCL for my own academic work, and been working on looking at different translations of these measures and how much they've been modified in use. And one of the things we've been discussing with the Common Measures Advisory Group is how far that is allowable and how far it's not. And I went into that process thinking, you know, if you change a single word, you can't call it the same measure. I'm now coming to the view, actually, there's so much noise in these measures anyway, that a little bit of sort of change may not be such a big deal, and that we ought to treat them as sort of broad brush measures, and that they seem to work good enough for our purposes, but we need to recognize their limitations. So that's where I'm moving to as a position personally, but I'd be interested in other people's views.
Thanks, Miranda.
Thanks, Miranda. I think that certainly that last point is one that's of interest to me and of interest to us here at CORC. And I think I may well be picking your brain at some point in the not too distant future about how that's going. Or possibly we'll be getting you to come back and talk about what you found out at a future forum or one of our events going forward. So thanks, Miranda. Always great to hear everything that's going on at Wellcome. And it feels like there's plenty that we can hear about in the future, all sorts of different things that certainly have piqued my interest. And I think it's great to hear when it's work in progress. It makes us excited for, you know, what you're going to be finding out, and very much wanting to keep in touch with you and share that across our networks and with all of our members. So thanks, Miranda. It's been absolutely brilliant, simulating some great conversations. So always good to see you, and thank you very much for your time.